The morning mist clung to Sarah Mitchell's farm like a protective veil, concealing secrets that would soon shatter the peaceful Montana dawn. As she tended her crops with practiced efficiency, few would guess that those calloused hands once commanded the most elite Delta Force units in military history. For 5 years, she'd buried Colonel Sarah Shadow Mitchell beneath the simple life of a farmer. But today, as 6 escaped prisoners make their way toward her isolated property, they're about to learn why her call signs struck fear into America's deadliest enemies. They see a vulnerable woman alone on a remote farm. What they don't realize is they're walking into a trap laid by someone who turned evasion and asymmetric warfare into an art form. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about how the wrong target can become your worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell's day began at 5 a.m. Old habits died hard. As dawn painted the Montana sky in shades of amber, she moved through her morning routine with unconscious precision. Her farmhouse, a modest 2-story structure nestled against rolling hills, appeared unremarkable to passing eyes. That was exactly how she wanted it. "Come on, Scout," she called to her Belgian Malinois, a retired military working dog who'd followed her into civilian life. The dog's alert posture mirrored her own controlled awareness, another habit she couldn't shake. The farm's layout seemed random to visitors: scattered outbuildings, winding paths between crops, irregular tree lines. But every element had been carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of view. Every approach to the house crossed at least 3 observation points. Natural choke points appeared accidental, old equipment placed just so, drainage ditches that channeled movement along predictable paths. Sarah checked her phone. A burner changed monthly. The local news headline caught her eye: "Prison break, 6 dangerous inmates still at large." Her jaw tightened. The escape had occurred 70 miles south, but distance meant little to desperate men. Sheriff Tom Hayes's truck appeared on her long driveway, dust trailing behind it. Sarah relaxed her stance deliberately, adopting the slightly stooped posture of someone who spent long days working the earth. The transformation was subtle but complete, from predator to farmer in the space of a breath. "Morning, Sarah," Hayes called out, climbing down from his vehicle. At 55, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent decades carrying a badge. "Thought I should stop by, given the news." "The prison break?" Sarah's voice carried just the right amount of concern. "Heard about that. Awful business." Hayes nodded, eyes scanning the property out of habit. "They're headed north, best we can tell. Already hit 2 gas stations for supplies. I'm checking on all our isolated properties, making sure folks are taking precautions." Sarah gestured to Scout, who sat alertly at her side. "Got my guard dog, plus the shotgun my daddy left me. Should be enough for any trouble." The lie came easily. The shotgun existed, but it was far from her only means of defense. About that, Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Might want to consider staying in town for a few days. These aren't your typical criminals, former military among them. Their leader, James Connor, was Special Forces before things went wrong for him." Sarah's pulse quickened. Slightly, though nothing showed on her face. Special Forces, that complicated things. "Appreciate the concern, Tom, but this farm needs daily attention. Can't just abandon it." "At least let me assign a deputy to patrol more frequently." "Really?" "I'll be fine." Sarah smiled, the expression reaching her eyes through years of practice. "Been taking care of myself out here for 5 years now." After Hayes left, Sarah dropped the act. She moved through her house, checking security measures that no civilian home should have. Pressure sensors along the perimeter, cameras disguised as wildlife fixtures, reinforced walls that could withstand small arms fire, all hidden beneath a veneer of rustic charm. In the barn, behind a false panel, her real equipment waited. The shotgun might be for show, but the customized M4 carbine, night vision gear, and tactical communications equipment were anything but decorative. She hadn't touched them in 5 years, had hoped never to need them again. Scout whined softly, picking up on her tension. "I know, boy," Sarah murmured, running a hand along his tactical vest. Another piece of equipment, carefully hidden from casual observers. Looks like retirement might be getting cut short. She spent the rest of the morning analyzing her property with fresh eyes. The farm's isolation, once a refuge, now presented tactical challenges. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, too far for any call for help to bring immediate response. But isolation also meant fewer potential civilian casualties if things went bad. Sarah mapped contingency plans as she worked, muscle memory from years of mission planning taking over. Multiple escape routes, pre-positioned equipment caches, areas that could be strategically denied to hostiles through controlled demolition if necessary. The farm wasn't just her home. It was a fortress, designed by someone who'd spent a career planning for worst-case scenarios. By afternoon, satellite imagery showed on her secured tablet, carefully routed through multiple proxies to hide her access to military-grade intelligence resources. The escaped prisoners had been moving steadily north, staying off main roads, showing a level of tactical awareness that confirmed time to wake up the old ghosts, Sarah whispered to Scout. She opened a hidden compartment in her office floor, revealing a secure communications setup. 5 years ago, she'd promised herself she'd never use it except in the most dire circumstances. But a special forces operator, leading desperate men in her direction, qualified. She sent a single encoded burst transmission, a series of numbers that would mean nothing to anyone except a very select group of people. Then she began preparing for war, all while maintaining the outward appearance of a simple farmer going about her daily routine. The sun set on what might be her last peaceful evening for a while. Sarah Mitchell, the farmer, had created a good life here, but Colonel Mitchell, the Delta Force operator, had chosen this location for more than just its agricultural potential. Soon, her uninvited guests would learn why. As twilight settled over the farm, Sarah cleaned her supposedly decorative shotgun, muscle memory carrying her through the motions. Her mind drifted to another time, another weapon. Kandahar province, 5 years ago. Shadow, we've got movement. Captain Rivera's voice crackled through her earpiece. Sarah Mitchell, then Colonel Mitchell, adjusted her position slightly, scanning the compound through thermal imaging. "Call it," she responded, her voice barely a whisper. 3 teams, professional movement patterns. They're good. We're better. That operation had been her last, a mission that officially never happened, targeting people who officially didn't exist. Her team had been outnumbered 4-1, but numbers had never been the deciding factor in her calculations. The present day, Sarah checked her phone again. The escaped prisoners had hit another store 2 hours ago, 40 miles closer. Their pattern was becoming clear, moving parallel to main roads, using forest cover, showing the kind of tactical awareness that came from professional training. Baghdad. 7 years ago, you've got a reputation, Colonel. General Harrison had leaned back in his chair, studying her with measured respect. They call you Shadow because you're never there until it's too late for the enemy to do anything about it. Just doing my job, sir. Your team has the highest success rate in Delta Force history, also the lowest casualty rate. That's not just doing a job, that's turning asymmetric warfare into an art form. Sarah had never cared for praise. Results were what mattered. Her team succeeded because she planned for every contingency, turned apparent disadvantages into tactical advantages, and never, ever underestimated an opponent. Scout's low growl pulled. Her back to the present, a deer had wandered too close to the perimeter. Sarah relaxed slightly, but noted how her hand had automatically moved to the hidden compartment under her kitchen counter. Classified location 6 years ago. Your mission. Profile is unique, Colonel, the CIA operative had said, sliding a folder across the table. You don't just complete objectives, you change the entire operational landscape, make it impossible for hostiles to maintain their presence in an area. That had been her specialty. Not just direct action, but comprehensive theater denial, making certain locations simply too costly for enemies to operate in, using methods that never traced back to US forces. Sarah stood, stretching muscles that still maintained their combat readiness despite 5 years of farming. She moved to her office, accessing the hidden computer system. James Connor's military record appeared on the screen, heavily redacted, but she could read between the lines. Special forces, multiple combat deployments, specialized in unconventional warfare before something snapped. Fort Bragg, 5 years ago. You're sure about this? General Harrison had asked during their final meeting. You've got at least another decade of operational capability. The unit needs you. It's time, sir. Sarah had placed her resignation papers on his desk. 20 years of shadows. It takes a toll. Where will you go? Somewhere quiet, somewhere I can build something instead of breaking things. But she hadn't just chosen Montana for its peace. She'd selected this specific location using the same tactical analysis she'd applied to military operations. Defendable terrain, multiple escape routes, natural surveillance advantages, and a community that valued privacy. Even in seeking peace, she'd prepared for war. In the present, Sarah completed her evening security check. To any observer, it would look like a farmer's normal routine, checking livestock, securing buildings, bringing in equipment. They wouldn't notice how each action allowed her to verify security measures, check fields of fire, and confirm that her early warning systems remained operational. Classified operation 8 years ago. How do you do it, Colonel? Lieutenant Chen had asked after a particularly difficult extraction. Turn every terrain into a weapon. You don't fight the ground, Lieutenant. You make it fight for you. Every feature, every limitation, every apparent disadvantage, they're all assets if you know how to use them. She'd applied that philosophy to building her civilian life. Every aspect of her farm served multiple purposes. The irrigation system could quickly turn solid ground into impassable mud. The scattered equipment created cover and concealment. Even the crop selection had been tactical. Tall corn provided visual blocks, dense bushes channeled movement. Sarah checked her secure phone one last time before shutting down for the night. The encoded message she'd sent earlier had been received, but no response had come yet. That was protocol. Her old team would verify the authentication codes, assess the situation, and respond only if absolutely necessary. She hadn't called for help, merely issued a warning. A shadow operation might be going hot. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the irony. She'd spent 20 years conducting operations in hostile territory. Now hostile territory was coming to her, but this time she had the home field advantage. Every inch of this farm had been prepared, every contingency planned for, every apparent vulnerability engineered to become a strength. James Connor might have special forces training, but he was about to learn the difference between being a good operator and being a shadow. If his team came here, they wouldn't be finding a simple farmer. They'd be walking into a trap 5 years in the making, designed by someone who'd turned evasion and area denial into a tactical science. Sarah Mitchell, the farmer, went to bed early, as farmers do. Colonel Mitchell, the shadow, remained alert, ready to wake at the slightest disturbance. And somewhere in the darkness, 6 desperate men were moving closer, completely unaware that they were heading towards someone who'd made a career out of making people disappear. The local diner buzzed with nervous energy the next morning. Sarah sat in her usual corner booth, appearing to focus on her coffee while her trained senses catalogued every conversation, every movement, every potential piece of intelligence. "They hit the Wilson store last night," Betty, the waitress, confided as she topped off Sarah's cup. "Took food, clothes, and ammunition. Poor Tom Wilson was terrified. Said their leader was cold as ice, military precise in his demands." Sarah nodded sympathetically, playing her role. "Scary times, they heading this way?" "That's what everyone's saying. Sheriff's got roadblocks up, but—" Betty lowered her voice. "These men, they're not using roads. Moving through the backcountry, like ghosts." The TV above the counter switched to breaking news. Security footage showed 6 men moving through Wilson's store with tactical precision. Sarah recognized their formation immediately. Standard Special Forces close-quarters movement. James Connor was maintaining his military discipline, which made him both more predictable and more dangerous. "Should stay at my daughter's in town." Martha Chen, who owned the farm next to Sarah's, spoke up from the adjacent booth. "Not safe for a woman alone out there." Sarah masked her irritation with a grateful smile. "Appreciate the concern, but can't leave the animals. Plus got that shotgun of mine." The bell above the door chimed. 2 state police officers entered, their faces grim. Sarah watched their reflection in the chrome napkin holder, noting their tactical gear partially hidden under civilian jackets. The manhunt was escalating. "Update from the command post," one officer announced to the room. "All residents in outlying areas are advised to maintain heightened security. These men are considered extremely dangerous. They've demonstrated military-level tactical knowledge and have acquired weapons." Sarah finished her coffee, paid her bill, and headed to her truck. Scout sat in the back, as always, but his posture was rigid, alert. He sensed the changing atmosphere. At the local hardware store, Sarah made what appeared to be routine purchases. Wire for fencing, tools, basic supplies. But each item had a tactical purpose. Wire could become trip lines. Tools could be improvised weapons, and the innocent-looking garden chemicals could be combined into something far more defensive. Her phone buzzed. A message from an encrypted number. "Package in transit. 24 hours. Maintain protocol." Her old team responding at last. They'd be in position within a day, ready to assist if needed. But they'd maintain distance unless she gave the signal. This was her operation. The drive home took her past 3 police checkpoints. Each time, she played her role perfectly. The concerned but determined farmer, just trying to keep her life running normally. The officers never suspected they were talking to someone who'd trained most of their tactical response teams. Back at the farm, Sarah began what looked like normal preparations for a storm. Boarding windows, securing equipment, bringing livestock into the barn. To her neighbors, it would appear she was simply being prudent given the weather forecast. In reality, she was creating firing positions, establishing kill zones, and ensuring her emergency exfiltration routes remained clear. The local news continued its breathless coverage. 6 escaped inmates, led by former Special Forces operator James Connor, continue to evade capture. Connor's military background has authorities particularly concerned. His group has demonstrated sophisticated evasion techniques. Sarah switched off the radio. The coverage was becoming repetitive, and she had work to do. The sun was setting. Earlier these days, and darkness would give Connor's team advantages, she'd rather deny them. A helicopter passed overhead, state police running infrared searches of the forest. Sarah knew they wouldn't find anything. Connor would have his men using thermal discipline, just as she'd taught her own teams. The thought caused her first. Real smile of the day. The police were using tactics she'd helped develop, hunting a man who'd learned from the same playbook. But they were all about to learn that the original author had a few chapters they'd never seen. Night fell over the farm like a tactical shroud. To any observer, Sarah Mitchell's property looked perfectly normal. A simple farm battened down against approaching weather. Only someone with very specific training would recognize the subtle signs, the slightly too regular placement of outdoor lights, the carefully maintained lines of sight, the almost invisible markers indicating pre-range distances. Sarah's final check of the perimeter revealed nothing amiss, but her instincts, honed through decades of combat, told her time was running out. Connor's team was close. They'd be watching, planning, looking for weaknesses. And they'd find exactly what she wanted them to find. An isolated farm run by a single woman, seemingly vulnerable. The perfect target. The perfect trap. Scout growled softly at her side, his ears pricking toward the distant forest. Sarah patted. His head, her other hand automatically checking the concealed sidearm under her jacket. "Soon, boy," she whispered. "Company's coming." The first sign came at 0300 hours, Scout's ears twitching in his sleep. Sarah was instantly awake, years of combat instincts overriding 5 years of civilian life. She remained motionless, controlling her breathing, listening. There, a subtle click from her perimeter sensors, disguised as ordinary wind chimes. Someone had crossed the outer boundary of her property, multiple someones, based on the pattern of activation. Sarah rose silently, already dressed. She hadn't properly undressed for sleep in 2 days. Through her bedroom window, the farm appeared, peaceful under the moonlight, but her trained eye caught the shadows moving wrong, the too careful rustling of corn stalks. 6 distinct movements, she sub-vocalized, old mission habits surfacing. Professional spacing, maintaining visual contact. Intervals. Connor was running this like a military operation. Good. That made him predictable. Scout stood alertly but silently beside her, waiting for commands. Sarah gave him a hand signal. Stay. Watch. The Belgian Malinois settled into guard position as she moved through her house, appearing to any observer like someone who'd been woken by a noise. Right on cue, her front porch creaked. Not an accident. They wanted her to know they were there. Sarah flicked on her porch light, shotgun in hand, playing her role perfectly. "Who's there?" she called out, letting a tremor of fear enter her voice. "I'm armed." "Just some travelers." "Needing help, ma'am?" The voice was controlled, professional. James Connor himself. "Car broke down a few miles back. Saw your lights." "It's the middle of the night," Sarah responded. "There's a town 15 miles south. Afraid we need immediate assistance." Connor's tone hardened slightly. "Best if you open the door, ma'am. We don't want any trouble." Sarah counted heartbeats, modeling their positions based on shadow movements and sound. 2 on the porch with Connor, 1 by her barn covering the back exit, 2 moving to flank the house, 1 holding a reserve position near her truck, standard tactical deployment. She'd have done the same if she were running the operation. "I'm calling the police," she announced, adding a shake to her voice. "Phone lines are down, ma'am." "Cell service. 2. Like I said, we don't want trouble, but we're coming in. How this goes is up to you." Sarah let her shotgun waver slightly as she opened the door, showing just enough fear to be convincing. James Connor stood on her porch, exactly as his military file photo showed. Tall, lean, with eyes that calculated everything. 2 men flanked him, holding pistols with professional grips. "The shotgun won't help," Connor said calmly. "Best put it down before someone gets hurt." Sarah let her hands tremble as she lowered the weapon. "What do you want?" "Just a place to rest. Some supplies, cooperation." Connor stepped into her house, his movement pure military precision. "Do exactly what we say and you'll be fine. You're them, aren't you?" Sarah forced a panicked edge into her voice. "The escaped prisoners. I saw the news." Connor smiled tightly. "Then you know how serious we are. Where's your phone?" "Kitchen counter." He nodded to one of his men who moved to secure the device. Sarah watched through her carefully crafted mask of fear as the other men entered her home. Their movements were disciplined, coordinated. They cleared rooms with practiced efficiency. "House is secure," one reported. "No other occupants. Barn and outbuildings?" Connor asked. "Martinez is checking now." Sarah suppressed a smile. Martinez would find exactly what she wanted him to find: farm equipment, livestock, and enough supplies to make this location valuable as a temporary haven. He wouldn't find the hidden caches, the weapons, the tactical gear. Not yet. "Sit down," Connor ordered Sarah, gesturing to her kitchen chair. "Keep your hands where we can see them." He studied her face. "You live here alone?" "Yes." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, portraying vulnerability. "My husband passed 3 years ago. Just me and my dog now." On cue, Scout growled from the hallway. One of Connor's men raised his weapon, but Connor held up a hand. "The dog stays in the bedroom. Close the door." Sarah gave Scout a frightened glance. "He won't hurt anyone?" The door. Now. She complied, whispering "stay" to Scout as she shut him in. The dog's answering whine was perfectly pitched to suggest fear rather than tactical preparation. Connor's team continued securing the house, their movements revealing their training. Sarah noted each man's position, weapon choice, and behavioral cues. 2 were ex-military, based on their movement patterns. The others were criminals, but disciplined ones. Connor had trained them well. "We'll need food," Connor announced. "Medical supplies, and you're going to help us resupply." "Please," Sarah let her voice crack. "Just take what you need and go." Connor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Not that simple. Police are hunting us. We need somewhere quiet to rest, plan our next move. Your farm is perfect, isolated, well-stocked, easy to defend." Sarah's heart rate spiked slightly at that last word. Connor was thinking tactically, seeing her farm's defensive advantages, but he was seeing them from the wrong perspective. "Martinez," Connor called out. "Situation?" "Barn's clear," came the reply. "Got vehicles, tools, enough supplies to last weeks. No close neighbors. It's ideal." "Good." Connor turned back to Sarah. "Here's how this works. You're going to go about your normal routine. Anyone stops by, everything's fine. You act natural, we stay comfortable, and when we're ready to move on, you get your farm back. Any deviation from that plan?" He left the threat unspoken. Sarah nodded frantically. "I understand, please don't hurt me." "That's entirely up to you." Connor assigned his men positions, maintaining clear fields of fire, establishing communication. Protocols. It was textbook Special Forces occupation of a strategic location. Sarah kept her expression terrified, compliant, but inside, her tactical mind was already moving pieces on the battlefield. Connor had chosen her farm for its defensive advantages, not realizing those same features would become weapons in her hands. He saw a frightened woman and a perfect hideout. He didn't see the trap closing around him. "Get some rest," Connor told her. "You'll need to be up early to tend to the animals. Remember, one wrong move, one sign to anyone that something's wrong, and this situation becomes unpleasant." Sarah retreated to her bedroom, where Scout waited. Only when the door was closed did she allow herself a small, grim smile. Phase 1 was complete. The enemy was exactly where she wanted them, deployed exactly as she'd anticipated. Now the real operation could begin. Dawn broke over the farm with deceptive normalcy. Sarah moved through her morning routine, feeling Connor's watchful eyes tracking her every movement. Martinez shadowed her to the barn, his weapon concealed but ready. "Just feeding the animals," she said timidly, measuring feed into buckets. Each movement was carefully choreographed, the frightened farmer going about her chores, but every step, every pause, served a purpose. The feed bucket scraped against the barn floor in a precise pattern, To anyone else, it would sound like clumsy nervousness. To her hidden security system, it was a coded activation sequence. Deep in the barn's foundation, dormant equipment hummed to life. "Don't try anything stupid," Martinez warned, watching. Her scatter feed for the chickens. He didn't notice how each handful mapped out distances, marking ranges and fields of fire that she'd memorized years ago. Sarah stumbled slightly, catching herself against the barn wall. Her trembling fingers found familiar marks, tiny pressure points that armed secondary systems. Above them, disguised as ordinary farm equipment, cameras activated, beginning their silent surveillance. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Just nervous." Inside the house, Connor had established his command post in her kitchen. His remaining men secured the perimeter, professional but not quite professional enough. They checked fence lines but missed the sensors hidden within them. They noted sight lines, but didn't recognize how each one had been engineered to create overlapping fields of fire. "Need to check the irrigation system," Sarah told Martinez, her voice carefully uncertain. "The timers, make it quick." She moved through her fields, adjusting irrigation controls. Each adjustment sent coded signals through the underground network she'd spent years establishing, pressure sensors armed, ready to transform fertile farmland into impassable terrain at her command. Connor appeared at the back door. "Everything okay out here?" "Fine," Martinez reported. "She's cooperating." Sarah dropped her wrench, bending to retrieve it with shaking hands. The movement let her confirm that her hidden transmitter was active, broadcasting encrypted signals to frequencies only certain people would monitor. "Your farm," Connor addressed her directly. "It's well maintained, efficient layout." His eyes scanned the property with professional appreciation. "Almost like it was designed for—" He trailed off, and Sarah let her fear show. Let him think. She was terrified of his scrutiny, rather than concerned he might spot the tactical thinking behind her farm's layout. My husband," she stammered. "He was very organized, military background. He planned everything carefully." Connor nodded slowly. The explanation fit what he saw. The defensive positioning, the clear fields of fire. Just another veteran's homestead, not worth deeper investigation. "The greenhouse needs attention," Sarah said softly. "Plants will die without proper care." Connor considered, then nodded. "Martinez, stay with her." The greenhouse's humid interior concealed more than tomatoes and peppers. As Sarah adjusted ventilation systems, hidden panels registered her movements. Equipment cached within the walls waited for activation codes that only she knew. By mid-morning, she'd managed to activate most of her primary systems. Her farm was awakening, transforming from a simple agricultural operation into the fortress it had always been designed to be. Connor and his men saw only a frightened woman, performing routine tasks. They didn't recognize how each task was another piece of an elaborate tactical puzzle. "Time to make lunch," she suggested meekly. "I usually cook enough for several days." "Good idea." Connor's smile remained cold. "Show us that rural hospitality." In the kitchen, Sarah began preparing a large stew. Steam rose from the pot, gradually increasing the humidity. None of Connor's men noticed how the moisture affected certain surfaces, revealing hidden markings visible only to trained eyes. Range markers, defensive positions, emergency exfiltration routes, all displayed in condensation patterns that would evaporate before anyone else could recognize them. "Smells good," one of Connor's men commented, breaking protocol to approach the kitchen. Sarah flinched away convincingly, using the movement to confirm the positions of her hidden weapons caches. "Jackson, maintain your position," Connor barked. The man retreated, disciplined but not quite disciplined enough. These weren't Delta Force operators. They were good, but they didn't have the training to recognize what was happening right in front of them. Throughout the day, Sarah continued. Her careful performance. Each fearful glance was a tactical assessment. Every nervous movement activated another system. Her farm was coming alive around them, preparing for a battle they didn't yet realize was coming. In her bedroom that evening, with Scout standing guard, Sarah reviewed her progress. Primary systems were online. Hidden cameras tracked enemy movements. Pressure sensors monitored their patrol patterns. Everything was prepared. Now she just needed the right moment, one opportunity to strike. Connor thought he'd found the perfect defensive position, not realizing he'd walked into a trap 5 years in the making. Sarah patted Scout's head, feeling the tactical vest hidden beneath his thick fur. "Soon, boy," she whispered. "Very soon." In the darkness, her farm hummed with invisible energy, waiting for its commander's signal to wake up and show its true nature. The trap was set. The enemy was in position. Now the real operation could begin. The second day of occupation began with a subtle shift in atmosphere. Sarah noticed it immediately. The microscopic changes in patrol patterns, the slightly longer glances at shadows, the growing tension in shoulders trained to stay relaxed. "Something's not right," Jackson muttered to Martinez during their perimeter check. Sarah, pretending to weed her garden, caught every word. "This place feels wrong." "You're getting paranoid," Martinez replied, but his trigger finger twitched, a telltale sign of growing unease. Sarah had spent the night making minute adjustments to her environment, a barely audible high-frequency tone from hidden speakers. Not enough to be noticed consciously, just enough to keep nerves on edge. Imperceptible changes in air pressure from her ventilation system, the occasional shadow that moved just wrong enough to draw attention without revealing its source. "The dog's weird," Jackson continued. "Military trained, has to be. Way it moves, the way it watches, it's just a farm dog," Martinez snapped, but Sarah saw him studying Scout more carefully. Connor emerged from the house, his special forces training evident in how quickly he assessed the morning situation. "Status report? Quiet night, boss," Martinez answered. But what? "Place feels different today. Can't put my finger on it." Sarah chose that moment to drop her trowel, flinching at the noise. Perfect timing. It broke their conversation, redirected their attention to her apparent fear rather than their growing suspicions. "Sorry," she whispered, hands trembling as she retrieved the tool. The movement allowed her to press another hidden switch, activating the next phase of her environmental modifications. Connor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, inside. Time to make breakfast." In the kitchen, Sarah played her role perfectly, the frightened hostage trying to appear useful. But each placement of plates, each clink of cutlery, followed a precise pattern. The sounds resonated with hidden frequencies she'd built into the walls, gradually increasing the subliminal tension. "Your husband," Connor said, suddenly watching her cook. "You said he was military. What branch?" "Army," Sarah replied softly. He didn't talk about it much." She let her hands shake slightly, selling the widow's grief while analyzing Connor's micro-expressions. "This farm," Connor pressed, "he designed it. Most of it, said he wanted it defensible." She looked down quickly as if afraid she'd said too much. Connor's posture shifted subtly. Special forces training included recognizing defensive positions, and he was finally starting to see the patterns. But Sarah's careful groundwork made him doubt his instincts. Surely a dead veteran's paranoid preparations couldn't be a real threat. "Boss," Reynolds called from outside. "Got movement on the road." Connor moved to the window. A police cruiser was approaching, running routine patrol. Sarah felt the tension spike among Connor's men. "Mrs. Mitchell," Connor's voice was deadly calm. "You're going to walk out there and send them away. Remember, what happens if you don't?" Sarah nodded fearfully, wiping her hands on her apron. As she walked to the door, she noted their defensive positions. Good, but not good enough. They'd missed 3 major angles of exposure that she could exploit. Later, "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Deputy Rogers called from his car. "Everything okay?" "Fine, just fine." Sarah wrung her hands, perfectly portraying nervous energy while using the gestures to signal in military hand code. Most cops wouldn't catch it, but Rogers was ex-Navy. His eyes widened slightly before his training kicked. "Well, just checking. Sheriff's got us running extra patrols with those prisoners loose." Rogers kept his tone casual, but Sarah saw him clock the barely visible figure in her window. "You sure you're okay out here alone?" "Oh yes, I'm fine. Scout keeps me safe." Another coded gesture. Rogers gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "All right then. You take care now." He drove away, but Sarah knew the message had been received. Law enforcement would maintain distance but stay alert. Perfect. She didn't need them rushing in, just maintaining a perimeter. Back inside, Connor studied her closely. "Good performance. Please," she whispered. "My animals need feeding." He nodded to Martinez, who followed her to the barn. Sarah moved through her tasks, each action calculated. The feed she scattered formed precise patterns, distance markers that her tactical systems would use later. The water she added to troughs changed pressure levels in underground systems. "Boss," Jackson's voice crackled over their radio. "Got another problem with the equipment shed. Lock's acting weird again." Sarah suppressed a smile. Her automated systems were working perfectly, creating small malfunctions that required Connor to split his forces repeatedly to investigate. Each problem seemed natural. Farm equipment did break down after all, but each one stretched their manpower thinner. "This place," Martinez muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Something about it." Sarah dropped a bucket. The clatter, masking the click of another system activating. By nightfall, her trap would be ready. Connor's men were already on edge, their tactical training working against them as they sensed the wrongness, but couldn't identify its source. They were starting to realize something wasn't right, but by the time they figured out what, it would be far too late. The game was already won. They just didn't know it yet. Night fell over the farm like a tactical shroud, bringing with it a tension that even Connor couldn't ignore. His men had spent the day jumping at shadows, their professional demeanor cracking under the strain of Sarah's carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. "Third equipment failure today," Reynolds reported, frustration evident in his voice. "First the tractor, then the generator, now the barn door mechanism. It's like this place is fighting us." Sarah, sitting quietly in her kitchen chair, noted how Connor's jaw tightened. His Special Forces training was finally picking up the patterns, but the evidence made no sense. How could a simple farm mount such a coordinated resistance? "Martinez," Connor called. "Check the—" A loud metallic clang from the barn cut him off. All heads turned toward the sound. "Probably just the wind," Sarah offered meekly. But she'd timed the automated noise perfectly, just as their night vision was adapting, just when tactical awareness was highest. The subsequent adrenaline spike would further fray their nerves. "Check it," Connor ordered. Martinez moved toward the barn, weapon ready. Sarah watched through lowered eyes as he passed through 3 different surveillance zones, his movement triggering silent alarms that only she could monitor. "Clear," Martinez called back. "But boss, you should see this." Connor went to the barn, leaving Reynolds to guard Sarah. Through the window's reflection, she watched their body language as they studied whatever they'd found. She knew exactly what they were seeing. Subtle marks in the barn's construction, too precise to be accidental, too tactical to be civilian. "Mrs. Mitchell," Connor's voice was dangerously controlled when he returned. "Your husband's modifications to this farm. Tell me about them." He was paranoid after his service. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, the picture of nervous uncertainty. "Always talking about security, about being prepared. I didn't understand most of it. The wall thickness in that barn isn't standard," Connor pressed. "The angle of the support beams, the sight lines from the loft. That's military engineering, Sarah." let her eyes widen with apparent fear. Is it? Like I said, he was very particular about the construction. A whisper of movement caught Connor's attention. Scout, shifting position upstairs. The dog's precise movements had been bothering his men all day, too disciplined to be explained by Sarah's story of a simple farm companion. "Your husband's name," Connor said slowly. "What was it?" "David. David Mitchell. Service record?" I don't know much. He didn't talk about it." Sarah looked down. "There were some medals, but I keep them stored away. Too painful to look at." Connor studied her face intently. She met his gaze with just the right mixture of fear and grief, while beneath her facade, she noted every tactical adjustment his men made. They were unconsciously shifting to defensive positions, their training responding to threats they sensed but couldn't identify. A distant owl call broke the tension, except it wasn't an owl. To most ears it would sound natural, but Sarah recognized the pattern. Her old team was in position, maintaining distance, but ready. Everything was proceeding according to plan. "Jackson, Reynolds, full perimeter sweep," Connor ordered. "Martinez, check our supplies. Something's not adding up here." Sarah watched them split up exactly as she'd intended. Divide and conquer, the oldest strategy in warfare. But in this case, they were dividing themselves, responding to her carefully laid psychological triggers. "The rain's going to be a problem," she said softly, noting the approaching storm clouds. On cue, thunder rolled in the distance. Connor's eyes snapped to the window. The storm was real. She'd been tracking it all day, but its arrival was perfect timing for the next phase of her operation. Rain would reduce visibility, mask sounds, and further strain already frayed nerves. "Boss," Jackson's radio crackled. "Found something weird in the tool shed. Some kind of, I don't know, looks military grade." Of course he had. Sarah had let that cache be just discoverable enough. Obsolete equipment that would raise questions without providing answers. Every discovery increased their paranoia while revealing nothing about her true capabilities. "Check the house again," Connor ordered Martinez. "Every room, every closet. Something about this isn't right." They wouldn't find anything obvious. Sarah's real equipment was too well hidden, her tactical setup too professionally concealed. But they'd find just enough oddities to keep them searching, to make them question everything while understanding nothing. The storm broke over the farm with perfect dramatic timing. Rain hammered the roof as lightning illuminated the yard in stark flashes. In those brilliant moments, shadows seemed to move wrong, shapes appeared and disappeared, and the farm's true nature flickered at the edges of perception. "Getting real." "Tired of this place," Reynolds muttered, jumping at another thundercrack. "Feels like we're being watched." They were being watched, of course. Sarah's surveillance system tracked their every move, analyzing patterns, identifying weaknesses. But more importantly, they were being herded. Not physically, but psychologically. Every doubt, every question, every moment of paranoia was another step in her carefully choreographed dance. Sarah sat quietly in her chair, the very picture of a frightened hostage, while around her 6 hardened criminals were slowly coming. Undone, not through violence or direct confrontation, but through the subtle art of psychological warfare that had made her a legend in Delta Force. The trap wasn't just her farm's physical defenses. The real trap was in their minds, and it was closing tighter with every passing hour. The storm's pre-dawn darkness brought new opportunities. Sarah had spent the night analyzing her captor's psychological weak points, mapping the fracture lines in their group dynamics. Now it was time to apply pressure. "Coffee?" she offered timidly, to Martinez, who'd drawn the early watch. She'd noted how he favored his left side, an old injury, probably military. "I usually add a little cinnamon." "Fine," he grunted, but his eyes softened slightly. Of all Connor's men, Martinez showed the most military discipline. That made him both dangerous and useful. "Must be hard," she ventured quietly, measuring coffee grounds. "Following someone else's command when you had your own unit once." "Martinez, stiffened. "What?" "Oh," Sarah ducked her head, feigning embarrassment. The way you move, how you maintain discipline, reminded me of my husband's commander friend. He was a sergeant first class." The words hit their mark. Martinez's posture shifted imperceptibly. Recognition, pride, then sudden suspicion. Sarah had just demonstrated knowledge she shouldn't have, but in a way that seemed innocent. The seed was planted. "Jackson's getting sloppy," she heard Martinez mutter to Reynolds later, perfectly timed for her to accidentally overhear while feeding chickens. No proper perimeter checks, breaking formation. Reynolds, the ex-con who tried hardest to emulate military bearing, straightened automatically. Sarah hid a smile. The division between the actual military men and the wannabes was widening. "Connor," Jackson's voice crackled over their radio, "got movement in the tree line." "Investigate," Connor ordered. "Alone? After what happened to the equipment shed? You questioning orders now?" Sarah noted the edge in Connor's voice. Perfect. His leadership style relied on absolute authority, but fear was making his men question that authority. "Time to add pressure. The storm damaged the north fence," she mentioned carefully to Connor. "Animals could get loose, unless someone with real military experience checks it. Those repairs can be tricky." Connor's eyes narrowed at the implied criticism of Jackson's capabilities, but he sent Martinez instead, exactly as she'd planned. The division between trained and untrained men grew wider, a series of small equipment malfunctions throughout the morning, all orchestrated by Sarah's hidden systems, required Connor to repeatedly split his forces. Each time, the assignment subtly emphasized the competence gap between his men. "Should have sent Martinez," Reynolds muttered after Jackson bungled another equipment check. "At least he knows what he's looking at." "Getting real tired of this amateur." Martinez responded loud enough for Jackson to hear. Sarah watched the tension build through careful misdirection and strategic mistakes. A dropped plate that startled Jackson into an unprofessional reaction. A seemingly innocent question about military protocol that Martinez answered automatically, making the others look untrained. "Your husband's military friends," she said softly to Connor while preparing lunch. "Did they ever visit here?" "The farms layout. It reminds me of how they'd talk about defensive positions." The question served multiple purposes. It reinforced Connor's growing suspicion about the farm's design, while suggesting that Sarah had absorbed military knowledge passively, explaining any slips in her performance. "Boss," Reynolds radioed. "Got another weird reading from that shed. Martinez should—" "I'll check it myself," Jackson interrupted. "Stand down," Connor ordered, but the damage was done. His men were now openly challenging the chain of command. Sarah's hidden cameras caught every micro-expression, every subtle shift in body language. The group was fracturing along predictable lines. Military versus civilian, experienced versus amateur, those who sensed the farm's wrongness versus those who denied it. "The animals are getting spooked," she mentioned to no one in particular. "They always know when something's wrong." On cue, her livestock began acting strangely, responding to subsonic frequencies she'd activated. The chickens clustered anxiously, the horses grew restless, and even the barn cats disappeared. Basic animal behavior, but to increasingly paranoid. Observers, it felt ominous. "Place is getting to them too," Martinez observed, his military training trying to make sense of the mounting anomalies. By evening, the group's cohesion was showing visible cracks. Connor had to repeatedly reinforce his authority. The men clustered in informal groups, military trained versus not, even during tactical operations. Their patrol patterns became sloppy as trust eroded. "Maybe we should have picked a different farm," Jackson suggested during dinner. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah sat quietly, portraying the perfect image of a frightened hostage, while around her, 6 hardened criminals were coming apart. Not through force, but through psychological pressure points applied with surgical precision, just like she'd been trained to do in Delta Force, break the enemy's will before engaging in direct combat. Connor thought he was running this operation, but Sarah was the one truly in command, and her tactical position grew stronger with every passing hour. The mistake happened during the third morning. Sarah had maintained her cover perfectly until then, but even Delta Force operators slip occasionally. It came down to muscle memory. 20 years of tactical movement patterns aren't easily suppressed. When the explosion rocked the equipment shed, a deliberate malfunction she'd orchestrated, Sarah's body reacted instinctively. Instead of flinching like a civilian, she dropped into a perfect tactical crouch, her hands automatically moving to positions that assumed the presence of weapons. Connor caught the movement. His eyes narrowed, Special Forces training recognizing the professional response. Sarah covered quickly, stumbling and falling in apparent fear, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. "Stay here," Connor ordered his men, then turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, a word." He led her to the kitchen, positioning them where his men couldn't hear. Sarah noted how he placed himself between her and potential weapons. He was good, but she was better. She'd already mapped 14 different ways to disarm him from this position. "That was quite a reaction," Connor said softly. "Not exactly what I'd expect from a farmer's widow." Sarah let tears well up in her eyes. I learned from David. Living alone out here, he insisted I learn some basic tactical response protocols." Connor's voice carried a dangerous edge. "That wasn't basic, that was professional." Before Sarah could respond, Martinez burst in. "Boss, we got problems. Reynolds and Jackson are at each other's throats. Something about the patrol schedule." The interruption was perfectly timed. Sarah had triggered another equipment malfunction to create it. Connor's attention divided, giving her time to compose herself. "Can't trust Jackson to run a proper patrol anyway," Martinez added, the growing division in the ranks evident in his tone. "No military background, no real training." "Enough," Connor snapped. But Sarah saw how the criticism landed. His leadership was fracturing, his men's confidence eroding. Time to push harder. She let her hands shake as she reached for a coffee mug, but accidentally used the movement to demonstrate another subtle tactical tell. Perfect economy of motion, minimal exposure to sightlines. "Your husband," Connor said suddenly, "what was his specialty in the military?" He didn't talk about it much." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, portraying vulnerability while actually moving closer to a concealed weapon cache. "Something classified. He had nightmares sometimes, talked in his sleep about Delta?" Connor's posture shifted instantly. Delta Force, the elite of the elite. Sarah watched his tactical mind reassess everything. The farm's layout, the equipment failures, the strange sensations of being watched. Suddenly, it all suggested something far more dangerous than a paranoid veteran's preparations. "Boss," Reynolds called from outside, "got movement on the perimeter sensors." "We don't have perimeter sensors," Jackson replied. "Then what the hell is this thing I found?" Sarah suppressed a smile. "Right on schedule," they were starting to discover. Her security system, but in fragments that raised more questions than answers. "Check it out," Connor ordered, but his men's response was telling. "Alone?" Jackson asked. "Not a chance," Martinez added. "This place, something's not right." The unity of Connor's team was crumbling. The military-trained members sensed the tactical preparations around them but couldn't piece it together. The others dismissed their concerns, creating deeper divisions. "Mrs. Mitchell," Connor's voice was quiet but intense, "I'm going to ask you one more time. What exactly did your husband do in the military?" Sarah let real tears fall. "The best. Lies contain truth. He said knowing would put me in danger, that some things about this farm were better left unexplained. A crash from the barn interrupted them. Sarah knew it was Scout, triggering another planned distraction, but Connor's men were too on edge to think rationally. "That's it," Jackson announced. "This place is rigged. We need to leave." "Stand down," Connor ordered, but his authority was weakening. His men were jumping at shadows, divided among themselves, sensing threats they couldn't identify. Sarah watched the psychological damage spread. Martinez and Reynolds, with their military background, recognized the tactical elements but couldn't explain them. Jackson and the others, lacking that training, swung between skepticism and paranoia. And Connor, he was the most dangerous. His special forces experience told him something was deeply wrong, but he couldn't risk appearing paranoid in front of his men. "The coffee's getting cold," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of a command tone. She saw Connor's head snap up, recognizing it. Another small crack in her facade, another seed of doubt planted. The trap was almost ready. Connor's team was unraveling, their cohesion destroyed by paranoia and internal divisions. Soon they'd be too fractured to mount an effective resistance. Sarah allowed herself a tiny smile as she poured coffee. They'd come expecting to find a helpless widow. Instead, they'd walked into a psychological operation run by someone who'd written the book on breaking enemy units, and the best part? They still didn't realize the true danger they were in. The breaking point came at sunset. Sarah had been pushing Connor's team to their psychological limits, and the strain was showing. Martinez and Reynolds had effectively stopped taking orders from anyone but Connor. Jackson and the others had devolved into barely controlled panic, jumping at every shadow. Then Scout gave the signal, 3 short barks in a pattern that only military handlers would recognize. Sarah's old team was moving into final position. Connor's head snapped up at the sound. That dog. His eyes locked onto Sarah's. "Military trained, isn't it?" Before she could respond, chaos erupted outside. The automated systems she'd spent days activating all triggered at once. Lights flickered in complex patterns. Hidden speakers embedded throughout the farm produced subaudible frequencies that set teeth on edge. Equipment malfunctioned in synchronized waves. "What the hell is happening?" Jackson screamed, all pretense of calm abandoned. "Quiet!" Connor ordered, but his authority was crumbling. Even he couldn't explain the farm's increasingly bizarre behavior. Sarah let her mask slip just slightly, allowing a hint of professional satisfaction to show. It was a calculated risk, but she needed to push them over the edge. "Mrs. Mitchell," Connor's voice was deadly quiet, "your husband's military records. What was his call sign?" I don't, because I've been thinking," he continued, moving with predatory grace, "about the tactical layout of this farm, about your reactions, about how everything started going wrong in synchronized professional patterns." Martinez burst in. "Boss, found something in the barn, hidden compartment under the floor. You need to see this." Sarah knew exactly what they'd found. She'd let them discover one of her decoy caches, just enough military equipment to confirm their fears, not enough to reveal her true capabilities. "Shadow," Connor said suddenly. "That's what's been bothering me. The way this whole farm fights back from the shadows, the way we're being herded, manipulated." His eyes widened. "Your husband wasn't Delta Force, was he?" Sarah allowed herself to stand straighter, letting just a fraction of her true bearing show. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know that call sign, Shadow, the Delta Force operator who wrote the book on psychological warfare, the one who could break enemy units without firing a shot." Connor's hand moved to his weapon. "But Shadow disappeared 5 years ago, right around the time you moved here." The facade was crumbling. Sarah watched their faces as realization dawned, the growing horror as they understood what they'd walked into. "Boss!" Reynolds called from outside, panic in his voice. "Got multiple heat signatures in the tree line. Professional movement patterns. We're surrounded. Nobody moves." Connor shouted, but his men were already fractured beyond repair. Jackson made a break for the door. Martinez moved to stop him. Reynolds raised his weapon, unsure who to target. Sarah stood perfectly still in the chaos, her presence suddenly commanding. Every movement now revealed years of tactical training. Even her stillness radiated lethal capability. "You're not David Mitchell's widow," Connor said, recognition and fear warring in his voice. "You're Colonel Sarah Mitchell, your shadow." A sound like thunder rolled across the farm, her old team triggering synchronized distractions. To Connor's panicked men, it seemed like an army was descending on them. 5 years, Sarah spoke, in her true voice for the first time, letting the command tone ring out. 5 years building this trap, testing security systems, preparing for any contingency. Her smile was predatory. "You really should have picked a different farm." "Take her," Connor ordered, but his men were too far gone. Martinez and Reynolds recognized the futility of fighting a Delta Force legend. Jackson and the others were paralyzed with fear. Scout moved like lightning, placing himself between Sarah and Connor's weapon. The dog's tactical vest was fully visible now, all pretense of being a simple farm animal abandoned. "You don't understand," Sarah continued calmly. "This isn't a hostage situation. It never was. This is a Delta Force operation, and you're all already captured. You just don't know it yet." As if to punctuate her words, every light on the farm went dark simultaneously. In the sudden blackness, Sarah's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Welcome to Shadow's playground, gentlemen. The real game is about to begin." The darkness lasted exactly 30 seconds, long enough for Sarah to disappear from where she'd been standing. When the lights returned, she had transformed. Gone was any trace of the frightened farmer. In her place stood Colonel Sarah Shadow Mitchell, her bearing radiating deadly competence. "Impressive setup you have here, Colonel," Connor managed, his Special Forces training allowing him to maintain some composure. "But you're still outnumbered." "Am I?" Sarah's voice carried the authority of countless combat operations. She moved, with liquid grace, toward her kitchen counter. "Check your weapons." Martinez was the first to realize. The ammunition had been systematically replaced with blanks during their sleep shifts. Sarah had spent 3 days preparing this moment, manipulating every detail. "Impossible," Jackson breathed. You kept watch exactly where and how I wanted you to," Sarah replied. "Every patrol pattern, every guard rotation, you followed the paths I laid out for you. Classic psychological conditioning." Connor's tactical mind was racing, reassessing everything. The equipment malfunctions, automated systems. This entire farm is a sophisticated tactical operations center. Sarah gestured around them. "Those surveillance blind spots you thought you found, designed to make you position your men exactly where I needed them. The police patrol this morning," Martinez realized, "you signaled them. Finally caught that, did you?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Ex-Navy, wasn't he? He'll have mobilized tactical response teams by now. They're just waiting for my signal." Reynolds made a break for the door. He made it 2 steps before Scout materialized, driving him back with military precision. The Belgian Malinois moved with the same lethal grace as his handler, all pretense of being a pet abandoned. "Your dog tags," Connor said suddenly. "In the bedroom. They're not your husband's, are they?" David Mitchell never existed. Sarah's voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "This entire farm, every piece of documentation, every background detail, it's all part of a Delta Force cover operation, 5 years in the making." The implications hit them like physical blows. They hadn't just stumbled into a defensible position. They'd walked into a fully operational military installation disguised as a farm, run by one of the most legendary operators in Delta Force history. The signatures in the tree line. Martinez's military training kicked in. "Your team," some of them. Sarah moved to her supposedly decorative cabinet, opening hidden panels to reveal tactical displays. "You're surrounded by the best special operations unit ever fielded. They've been here since day one, waiting for my signal." Connor's hand tightened on his weapon. "You're bluffing." Sarah's laugh was cold. "Look at your 3 o'clock position. See that slight distortion in the air? That's Captain Rivera, best sniper in Delta Force. He's had you in his sights for 3 days. On cue, a laser sight appeared on Connor's chest. You're 5 o'clock. Major Chen, demo expert. She's wired this entire farm with enough controlled charges to turn it into a crater. And Lieutenant Rodriguez has been monitoring your communications from the moment you arrived." Each revelation struck with precision, dismantling their remaining confidence. They hadn't just underestimated their target. They'd walked into a trap laid by someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of psychological warfare. "Why here?" Connor asked, his tactical mind still trying to understand. "Why maintain this cover?" "Because sometimes the best way to disappear is to hide in plain sight." Sarah activated another hidden panel, revealing a command center that would put most military installations to shame. "This farm isn't just my cover. It's a forward operating base for classified Delta Force operations. Has been for 5 years. The truth hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't just taken a random hostage, they'd tried to occupy a black site run by one of the most dangerous special operations commanders in military history. "So what happens now, Colonel?" Connor's voice was resigned, but professional. "Now." Sarah's smile was predatory. "Now you understand why they called me Shadow. By the time you realized the danger, you were already defeated. You just didn't know it yet." Outside, multiple figures emerged from hiding positions. Her Delta Force team, moving with the precision that made them legendary. The farm's true nature revealed itself as hidden panels opened, weapon systems deployed, and sophisticated security measures activated. "Welcome to my world, gentlemen," Sarah announced, every word carrying the weight of absolute command. "The question isn't whether you'll be captured. That was decided the moment you chose this farm. The question is, how many of you will be smart enough to surrender before I demonstrate exactly why Delta Force operators tell stories about Shadow?" Connor looked around at his broken team, at the revealed military installation, at the legendary operator they'd mistaken for an easy target. His Special Forces training told him there was only one possible response. He laid down his weapon. "Wise choice," Sarah said, then spoke into a concealed comm unit. "Shadow to all units. Operation Farmhouses go. Execute containment protocols." The farm erupted into synchronized action as her team emerged from their hiding spots. In moments, Connor's men were surrounded by some of the most elite operators in military history, all under the command of the woman they'd thought was just a simple farmer. The trap wasn't just complete, it had been complete before they'd ever arrived. They just hadn't been able to see it until Shadow decided to show them exactly what they'd walked into. The farm transformed around them with military precision. Hidden panels slid open in walls, revealing weapon racks and tactical gear. Camouflaged hatches in the ground exposed underground passages. Even the barn's innocent appearance dissolved. As armored shutters deployed over its windows. "Impressive what you can hide in plain sight," Sarah commented, now fully in her element as Colonel Mitchell. She moved through her command center with practiced efficiency, every gesture demonstrating the authority that had made her a legend in Delta Force. Connor watched with professional appreciation as her team emerged from their hiding spots. Each operator was a ghost story in special operations circles, and she had them all here. "Captain Rivera?" Sarah nodded to her sniper, who materialized from what had appeared to be solid wall. "Status? Perimeter secure, Colonel." Local law enforcement has established outer containment. Our QRF is on standby. But Connor wasn't finished. With the speed that had made him special forces, he lunged for what looked like a weapon rack. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous. Before anyone else could move, she had him disarmed and pinned with a level of combat expertise that made his special forces training look amateur. 20 years leading Delta Force's most classified operations, she said calmly, maintaining the hold with minimal effort. Did you really think you could outfight Shadow? The stories didn't do you justice, Connor managed through gritted teeth. They said you could outthink any enemy, but they never mentioned the combat skills. That's because anyone who saw them firsthand never lived to tell about it. She released him with tactical precision, maintaining perfect positioning. Martinez Reynolds, your military background means you understand what you're dealing with. Make the smart choice. The two men exchanged glances, then slowly raised their hands. They'd seen enough to know resistance was futile. Jackson, Sarah turned to the increasingly panicked man. You're about to do something stupid, don't. Jackson's hand had been inching toward a concealed weapon. He froze, realizing she'd tracked his movement without even looking at him. Chen, Sarah spoke into her calm, activate Protocol Echo. Show them what they're dealing with. The farm's exterior lights died, plunging the surrounding area into darkness. Then one by one, hidden floodlights activated, revealing dozens of concealed defensive positions. Each one held a Delta Force operator, their weapons trained with lethal precision. This isn't just a farm, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of command. It's one of the most sophisticated forward operating bases ever constructed. Those fields you walked through, mapped with precision targeting grids, the irrigation system can turn any sector into impassable terrain. Even the livestock are trained to respond to tactical signals. As if on cue, her horses moved into formation, displaying the military breeding that their farm animal appearance had concealed. Scout took up a tactical position, his specially designed gear now fully visible. Your infiltration route? She continued, activating a holographic display. We tracked every movement, those equipment malfunctions, precision psychological warfare. Every step you took, every position you chose was calculated to bring you exactly where I wanted you. Connor's tactical mind was racing, recognizing the mastery of her operation. The whole hostage situation was a test, Sarah finished. Delta Force needed to verify this facility's effectiveness as a covert operations center. You provided a perfect opportunity for a live-fire exercise. The implications hit them hard. They hadn't just stumbled into a trap. They'd become unwitting participants in a Delta Force training operation. "Colonel," Rivera called from his position, "we've got movement on the perimeter. Looks like their backup finally figured out something's wrong." Sarah smiled coldly. "Right on schedule. Chen, initiate containment protocols. Rodriguez, signal. The QRF. Time to show them why they call this place Shadow's Playground." The farm's defensive systems activated in synchronized waves. Hidden barriers emerged from the ground. Concealed weapon emplacements revealed themselves. The entire property transformed from agricultural land into a military stronghold. "Last chance," Sarah addressed Connor's team. "Surrender now, or I demonstrate exactly why Delta Force operators still tell stories about Shadow's tactical capabilities." Jackson broke first, throwing down his weapon. Reynolds and Martinez followed, their military training telling them they were hopelessly outmatched. The others looked to Connor, waiting for his decision. Connor met Sarah's gaze. "Special Forces operator, to Delta Force legend. I yield to superior force, Colonel. The field is yours." Wise choice. Sarah activated her command console. "All units, execute Phase 2. Let's introduce our uninvited guests to the full capabilities of this facility." Around them, Shadow's playground came fully alive. ready to demonstrate why it had become one of the most feared names in special operations. Sarah's tactical display showed 12 heat signatures approaching from the north. Connor's backup, finally realizing something had gone wrong. They moved with some military precision, but nothing compared to Delta Force standards. Amateur. Hour, Rivera commented from his sniper position. They're bunching up in predictable patterns. Let them come, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her legendary. Time to demonstrate why this facility's defense systems are classified above top secret. She turned to Connor, who watched with professional appreciation as she coordinated her forces. Pay attention. You're about to see why they called me Shadow. Chen, initiate sonic deterrence. Sarah's commands flowed with practiced ease. Rodriguez, prepare for communications blackout. Rivera, designate targeting zones but hold fire. The key. Approaching force hit her first defensive line. Hidden speakers activated, broadcasting frequencies designed to disorient and confuse. Their tactical formation immediately broke down. They're splitting up, Martinez observed, his military training, helping him appreciate the elegance of her strategy. Just like we did. Psychological Warfare 101, Sarah explained, monitoring their deteriorating formation. Disrupt unit cohesion before engaging. The same techniques I used on your team, but now at full power. The intruders tried regrouping, only to find the terrain itself working against them. Areas that had looked solid turned to mud. Clear paths led them into kill zones. Every attempt to establish tactical positions was met with perfectly prepared countermeasures. Colonel, Rodriguez called from his communication station, they're trying to call for backup. Want me to let it through? Sarah's smile was predatory. Let them. Every criminal organization in 3 states should see what happens when they threaten this position. She activated her facility's external cameras, broadcasting tactical feeds to her command center. Connor's backup team was falling apart, their tactical discipline crumbling as Sarah's defensive systems systematically destroyed their confidence. Watch and learn, she told her captives. This is how Delta Force handles multiple hostile forces. The farm's automated defenses activated in synchronized waves. Hidden lights created disorienting patterns. Speakers broadcast contradictory commands in multiple voices. Every sense was targeted. Every tactical response countered before it could. Form. They're retreating to Sector 7, Rivera reported. Exactly as planned. Sarah's fingers danced across her tactical console. Chen, activate containment protocols in Sectors 6 through 8. Hidden barriers emerged from the ground, cutting off their escape routes. The intruders found themselves herded into precisely prepared containment zones, their every attempt at resistance predicted and countered. This is impossible, Jackson whispered, watching the tactical display. You're playing them like a chess master. No, Connor corrected, professional respect evident in his voice. This is Shadow at work. Every move predicted, every response. Prepared for, we never had a chance. Sarah activated her command channel. All units prepare for final containment. Execute program midnight. The farm's exterior lights died simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, her Delta Force team moved like ghosts, their years of training under her command evident in every precise movement. You don't just train operators, Connor realized, watching her coordinate the operation. You perfect them. Why do you think they call this place Shadow's Playground? Sarah's attention never left her tactical displays. Every operator who trains here learns to move like a ghost, think like a strategist, and fight like a shadow. The intruders. Heat signatures showed increasing panic as they realized the full extent of their situation. They weren't just facing a defensive position. They were caught in an elaborate trap designed by someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of tactical warfare. Final warning. Sarah broadcast on all frequencies. You've entered a restricted Military facility. Surrender now or face the consequences. She turned to Connor. Watch closely. You're about to see why Delta Force Command stationed me here. This isn't just a forward operating base. It's a testing ground for our most advanced tactical systems. The farm hummed with lethal energy as Sarah prepared to demonstrate exactly why Shadow's playground had become legendary in special operations. Circles. Her trap was set, her team was in position, and her enemies were exactly where she wanted them. The real demonstration of power was about to begin. The night exploded into choreographed chaos. Sarah moved like a force of nature, every action displaying the skills that had made her Delta Force's most legendary operator. Her tactical systems engaged in perfect synchronization, transforming the farm into a symphony of sophisticated warfare. Chen, execute pattern Delta, she commanded. Rivera, clean up on any strays. Rodriguez, maintain communications blackout. The approaching hostile force never stood a chance. They'd come expecting to rescue their comrades from a hostage situation. Instead, they'd walked into a tactical operation orchestrated by Shadow herself. First team breaking left, Rivera reported, from his sniper nest. Moving into kill zone Charlie. Let them. Sarah's smile was cold. Time to demonstrate our active countermeasures. The ground beneath the intruder's feet suddenly transformed. Hidden systems activated, turning solid earth into unstable terrain. Their tactical formation collapsed as they struggled to maintain footing. You're herding them, Connor observed with professional appreciation. Every escape route leads exactly where you want them. Welcome to Shadow's playground, Sarah replied, her fingers dancing across tactical controls. Where every piece of ground is a weapon, every shadow hides a surprise, and every apparent escape route is part of the trap. The intruders tried regrouping, attempting to establish defensive positions. Sarah countered each move before they could complete it. Hidden barriers rose and fell, automated systems engaged and disengaged, creating an ever-changing battlefield that only she could navigate. Colonel, Rodriguez called out, they're trying to coordinate a synchronized assault. Sarah's laugh was pure predator. Perfect. Chen, initiate sonic warfare protocols. Let's show them why Delta Force operators fear this place. Hidden speakers activated, broadcasting frequencies designed to disorient and confuse. The intruders' formation broke completely as their inner ear balance was disrupted. Their tactical coordination dissolved into chaos. Watch and learn, Sarah told her captive audience. This is how you dismantle a hostile force without firing a shot. She moved through her command center with lethal grace, coordinating her team's movements with practiced precision. Each operator responded instantly to her commands, demonstrating the results of years training under Shadow's leadership. 3. Tango's breaking for the tree line, Rivera reported. Into my trap, Sarah confirmed. She activated another system, and the trees themselves seemed to come alive with movement. Carefully prepared hydraulic systems shook branches, creating disorienting patterns that destroyed night vision effectiveness. Jesus, Jackson whispered. The whole farm is rigged. Not rigged, Connor corrected, watching Sarah work. Weaponized. Every feature, every element designed to be part of her tactical arsenal. The intruders made their final mistake. They clustered together, seeking safety in numbers. Sarah's smile turned predatory as she activated her masterstroke. All units, execute midnight protocol, she commanded. The farm's exterior lights died simultaneously, plunging the area into total darkness. Then, one by one, hidden illumination systems activated, creating a strobing effect that destroyed all depth perception and tactical awareness. They're completely blind, Martinez breathed. That's not the best part, Sarah replied. Watch. Her Delta Force team moved like ghosts through the chaos, their years of training in this environment evident in every motion. While the intruders stumbled and fell, her operators flowed like water, systematically disarming and neutralizing each threat. Containment teams, move in, Sarah ordered. Chen, prepare for final sweep. Rivera, maintain overwatch. The operation concluded with surgical precision. Within minutes, the entire hostile force was captured, disarmed, and secured. Not a single shot fired, not one lethal blow struck, just pure tactical superiority executed to perfection. That, Sarah announced to her captive audience, is why they call me Shadow. Not because I hide in the darkness, but because by the time you see me coming, it's already too late. Connor studied her with new respect. The stories about you, they didn't do you justice. The stories you heard were just what we let slip, Sarah replied. The real operations, the ones that earned me this command, those never made it into any report. She turned to her tactical display, watching as her team secured the last of the intruders. The farm hummed around them, its sophisticated systems returning to standby mode, once again hiding their lethal capabilities beneath an innocent agricultural facade. Colonel, Rivera called in. Area secured, all hostiles contained, no casualties. Sarah nodded in satisfaction. That's how Delta Force does it. Maximum effectiveness, minimum force. When it's done right, the enemy is defeated before they realize they're in combat. The night settled into an eerie calm as Shadow's playground completed its demonstration of power. Sarah Mitchell, the simple farmer, had fully transformed into Colonel Mitchell, the Delta Force legend, and her enemies had learned exactly why that transformation was something to fear. Dawn approached as Sarah secured the last elements of her operation. Her command center displayed the full scope of her victory. 23 captured hostiles, an entire criminal network neutralized, and her facilities cover still perfectly maintained. Local authorities are standing by, Rodriguez reported. FBI tactical teams too. They're waiting for your signal. Not yet. Sarah studied Connor, who watched her with a mixture of respect and resignation. We have one final piece to resolve. The last play. Connor nodded, understanding. You want the intelligence. Smart man. Sarah's voice carried the authority of countless successful operations. Your organization thought they found an easy target. Instead, they handed me everything I need to dismantle their entire network. She activated a holographic display, showing a web of criminal connections. Every person who helped plan this operation, every safe house they used, every communication channel, we tracked it all. The moment you stepped onto my farm, you triggered the largest covert intelligence gathering operation in the region. That's why you let our backup get so close, Martinez realized. You wanted to identify all the players. Shadow's first rule of tactical warfare, Sarah confirmed. Don't just defeat the enemy in front of you, eliminate their ability to pose future threats. Connor straightened, his special forces training evident in his bearing. What do you want to know? Everything. Sarah's smile was predatory. Starting with your organization's command structure and ending with every operation they're running within 1,000 miles of my facility. She nodded to Rodriguez, who prepared to record the intelligence. But Connor wasn't finished. With explosive speed, he broke his restraints and lunged for Sarah's tactical console. Her response was instantaneous and devastating. 20 years of Delta Force hand-to-hand combat training manifested in a blur of precise strikes. Connor found himself disabled and resecured before his fingers could touch the controls. Impressive attempt, Sarah commented, not even breathing. Hard, but I've trained hundreds of operators better than you. Had to try, Connor managed through gritted teeth. Professional courtesy. Appreciated. Now, about that intelligence. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Connor, recognizing the futility of resistance, provided detailed information about his organization's operations. Sarah's tactical display filled with data as she systematically mapped out the entire criminal network. Colonel, Chen called over the comm, local authorities are getting restless. We need to transition custody soon to maintain our cover. Sarah nodded. Time to wrap this up. Rivera, prepare for handoff. Rodriguez, sanitize all tactical data. Chen, reset facility defense systems. She turned to her captives. Here's how this plays out. In 10 minutes, law enforcement will discover that a brave farmer managed to subdue escaped prisoners through a combination of luck and home security systems. They'll find evidence supporting that story, and nothing more. And if we tell them differently, Jackson asked. Sarah's laugh was cold. Who would believe you? A group of criminals claiming they were captured by a secret Delta Force installation, disguised as a farm. You'd be in psychiatric evaluation before you finished the sentence. Connor nodded in understanding. The perfect cover. No one would believe the truth, even if we told it. Exactly. Sarah activated her facility's reset protocols. Hidden systems began disappearing, tactical equipment retracted into concealed compartments, and the farm slowly transformed back into its innocent appearance. One last thing, she addressed Connor directly. When word of this gets back to your organization, make sure they understand this territory is protected, not by police, not by traditional military, but by something far more dangerous. By shadow, Connor finished. And her playground, Sarah confirmed, where every shadow hides a Delta Force operator, every innocent feature conceals a tactical system, and every attempted invasion becomes a lesson in why some targets should never be engaged. The sun rose over what appeared to be a simple Montana farm, erasing all evidence of the night's operation. Sarah Mitchell, the deadly Delta Force commander, once again became Sarah Mitchell, the unassuming farmer. But her enemies would remember. They would spread the word. Some places you don't attack, some targets you don't engage, and some shadows are deadly enough to swallow entire criminal organizations whole. Sheriff Hayes arrived with the morning sun to find a scene that defied easy explanation. Sarah Mitchell, the unassuming farmer, stood calmly on her porch, while 23 captured criminals sat zip-tied and subdued across her property. "Ma'am," Hayes approached cautiously, taking in the situation. "Want to tell me what happened here?" Sarah had already transformed back into her cover persona, letting her shoulders slump with apparent exhaustion. "They underestimated a farmer's ingenuity, Sheriff, and my late husband's paranoia about home security. FBI tactical teams swarmed the property, documenting evidence that would perfectly support her story. They found exactly what she wanted them to find: security cameras in logical places, simple traps that a veteran might set up, nothing that suggested military-grade tactical systems. Agent Phillips, Hayes greeted the FBI lead investigator, making anything of this. Phillips surveyed the scene with professional scrutiny. If he noticed how the captured criminals avoided looking at Sarah, how they flinched every time she moved, he didn't mention it. "Preliminary assessment suggests they got cocky," Phillips replied. "Thought a lone woman on an isolated farm would be an easy target. Didn't count on her preparation or resourcefulness." Sarah hid a smile. Phillips was one of the few who knew her true identity. His presence here was no accident. Some covers were too valuable to risk, some operations too sensitive to expose. "Lucky thing about farms," Sarah offered timidly. "Lots of tools that can be improvised for defense, and my husband, he was always particular about security." Hayes nodded sympathetically, buying the story completely. "Don't suppose we'll need to worry about more uninvited guests after word of this gets around?" "No," Sarah agreed softly, but her eyes met Connor's across the yard. "I don't suppose we will." Connor, being led to a transport vehicle, gave her a barely perceptible nod. He would spread the word in channels law enforcement would never access. Some targets weren't worth the risk. Some shadows were better left undisturbed. "You'll need to come down to the station," Hayes said. "Give a formal statement." "Of course." Sarah gestured to her property. "Just let me secure the animals first. Scout gets anxious around strangers." The Belgian Malinois sat alertly at her side, once again playing the role of simple farm dog rather than the highly trained military asset. He was, like handler, like dog, their deadliest capabilities hidden beneath perfect cover. As law enforcement processed the scene, Sarah's hidden systems completed their reset protocols. By nightfall, her facility would again be invisible, ready for its next covert operation. The farm would continue its dual role, a forward-operating base disguised as an agricultural operation, protected by the most sophisticated cover story. In Delta Force history, some shadows, after all, are meant to stay hidden. A week after the incident, Sarah stood in her command center, reviewing tactical data with her team. The facility had returned to its covert operational status, every trace of the recent conflict erased. Intel from Connor's organization confirms. Idun Rodriguez reported, "They've declared this entire region a no-go zone. The legend of the farm that swallowed 23 operators whole is spreading through all the right channels." Perfect. Sarah studied the tactical display showing threat assessments. Sometimes the best defense is a reputation that makes enemies think twice. Local coverage is playing exactly as planned, Chen added. Heroic farmer overcomes criminals. Through luck and preparation, not a single reporter has questioned the official story. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The operation had accomplished multiple objectives, neutralizing immediate threats, gathering critical intelligence, and strengthening her cover identity. Even her neighbors now saw her as the lucky widow who'd managed to outsmart criminals, making her seeming harmlessness even more believable. "Colonel?" Rivera's voice carried a note of curiosity. "After this success, Command might want you back in more active operations." "This is active operations, Captain." Sarah activated her facility's full tactical display, showing ongoing missions and intelligence gathering. Sometimes the most effective position is hiding in plain sight, protecting something bigger than yourself. She moved to her window, watching. The morning sun illuminate her farm. To any observer, they'd see a simple agricultural operation recovering from a dramatic incident. They wouldn't see the sophisticated forward operating base, the ongoing covert missions, or the Delta Force legend who'd chosen this particular shadow to inhabit. "Besides," she said softly, "every shadow needs a place to call home." Scout padded up beside her, alert and ready as always. Together, they watched their domain, a playground for ghosts, a trap for the unwary, and a reminder that sometimes the deadliest operators are the ones you never see coming. The farm had proven its worth as both cover and fortress. And somewhere, in the darkness, enemies would whisper about the shadow that lived there, never realizing that was exactly what she wanted them to do. After all, the best operations are the ones that become ghost stories. And Shadow's playground had just become a legend.